I will tell you exactly how it began, because the beginning was so thoroughly undignified that I have spent years trying to find a better one, and I cannot. My grandmother was dying. That is the true opening of every version of this story, because without that fact there is no Verity Holt, no fortnight at Caldenmere, no moment by the churchyard gate in the frost when a man who had governed an entire county without flinching stood with his hat in his hands and could not find a single word. My grandmother was dying, and she had one remaining wish, and the wish was absurd, and I agreed to it anyway, because she was the only person in England who had ever looked at me without wanting something from the looking. Her name was Honoria Carew, Dowager Duchess of Caldenmere, and she had outlasted 2 monarchs, a parliamentary reform, and 3 attempts by my own solicitors to reduce her allowance. She was 81 years old, and she was not afraid of dying. She was afraid, she told me, of leaving me alone. "You will become a monument," she said. She was propped against 4 pillows in the great bedroom on the 2nd floor of Caldenmere Court, a room that smelled of lavender and candle tallow and the particular cold that lives in Yorkshire stone no matter how many fires you lay. Men become monuments, Edmund. They stop moving. They stop feeling. They stand in one place long enough and people begin to put flowers at their feet. I told her I was perfectly well. "You are perfectly correct," she said. "That is not the same thing." She wanted to see me engaged to be married before she died. Not married, she was not without practicality, and she understood that a formal engagement could be arranged in days, while a wedding required months she did not have. She wanted to see me with a woman beside me. She wanted to believe in her last weeks that I would not harden entirely into the Duke of Caldenmere and forget that I had once, as a boy of 7, cried at the death of a dog named Pepper for the better part of an afternoon. I told her I would see what I could do. What I could do, as it turned out, was ring for Carver, my secretary, and explain the situation to him with as little visible embarrassment as possible. Carver had worked for me for 11 years. He was not easily surprised. He was, however, briefly quiet in a way that told me he was surprised. "You require a woman," he said carefully, "to agree to a temporary arrangement, an engagement in name only for the duration of Her Grace's remaining weeks, with the understanding that when the arrangement concludes, both parties return to their previous circumstances with their reputations intact." That is what I said. And this woman would come to Caldenmere. My grandmother cannot travel, yes. Another pause. Carver was a meticulous man. When he paused, he was cataloguing. "There is a Miss Verity Holt," he said at last. "I mention her only because she is known to me through a connection in the village. Her father is the rector at Edholt. She is 26, unmarried, educated. She is, by all accounts, a woman of considerable steadiness." "Steadiness," I repeated. "She is not easily rattled," Carver said. "I believe that may be a requirement." He was not wrong. I did not meet Verity Holt before the arrangement was made. That was, in retrospect, a remarkable oversight, but at the time it seemed perfectly sensible. Carver had spoken with her father, the terms had been explained and accepted, and a letter had been exchanged, formal and brief, between Miss Holt and myself, confirming the details. She would arrive on the 3rd of November. She would remain for a fortnight. She would be introduced to my grandmother as my intended. She would be compensated for her time in a manner that would allow her father's church roof to be repaired, which was apparently a pressing concern. At the end of 14 days, she would return to Edholt. I would tell my grandmother we had agreed to wait, and the matter would conclude. It was a clean arrangement. I was accustomed to clean arrangements. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a hired cart, because the lane from Edholt to Caldenmere Court had flooded at the lower crossing, and the larger carriage I'd sent could not pass. I was informed of this by Mrs. Alton, my housekeeper, who appeared in my study with an expression that suggested she had revised her opinion of me recently, and not in my favor. "Miss Holt is in the entrance hall, Your Grace." She walked the last quarter mile. I went down. I had formed, without examining it, a certain impression of what a rector's daughter willing to play this particular role would look like. Tired, perhaps, a little worn at the edges, grateful in a way that would make me feel, throughout the fortnight, like a man performing a charity. Verity Holt was standing in my entrance hall wringing water from the hem of her traveling cloak, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had done more inconvenient things than this and expected to do more again. Her hair, which was the color of autumn bracken, dark gold and copper mixed, had come loose on one side, and she had not bothered to pin it back. She looked up when I came down the stairs. She had steady gray eyes, the sort that appear to be taking a measurement. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy, she was already managing the wet cloak, but she dipped her chin in a way that acknowledged the omission without apologizing for it. "I am sorry about the cart. Your road wants drainage at the lower end." I blinked. "I am aware," I said. "Then I expect you have plans to address it." She handed the cloak to Mrs. Alton, who took it with an expression of open delight at this exchange. "I am Verity Holt. You are nothing like I expected, which I suspect is true in the other direction as well, so we are even. Is there somewhere we could speak before I meet your grandmother? I'd like to understand the ground I'm walking on." I looked at her for a moment. I could not have told you in that moment whether I was annoyed or relieved. Both, perhaps. "This way," I said. We sat in the library. A fire had been lit. The early November cold at Caldenmere was not gradual. It arrived fully formed, and Verity Holt sat in the chair across from my own, and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with those measuring gray eyes. "Tell me about her," she said. "Your grandmother, not the arrangement. I understand the arrangement. Tell me about her." I had not expected that. "She is," I said, and then stopped, because I was not accustomed to being asked for something like this and did not immediately know how to produce it. "She is the most honest person I have ever known. She says what she thinks without cruelty and without evasion, and those are rarer qualities in combination than people suppose. She has been the fixed point of this house for 60 years. She is very small now, at the end, but she is still entirely herself." Verity was quiet. She was watching me in a way that was not quite sympathy and not quite appraisal, something in between. "What would she ask me?" she said. "If I am to do this properly, I ought to know what she will want to know." "She will ask how we met," I said. "She will ask what I said to you, and what you said to me, and whether I made her laugh." "Did you?" "We have only just met." "Yes," Verity said, "and you have not made me laugh either, so that part I believe." She said it without malice, only with precision, and then she almost smiled, a small, controlled thing at the corner of her mouth, like a door not quite shut. "I will manage it. I am a rector's daughter. I have been managing politely impossible situations since I was 12. "This is rather different from a parish dispute," I said. "The principle is the same," she said. "You say the true thing as gently as the circumstances allow, and you hold your ground with courtesy, and you do not blink when someone tries to see whether you will." She paused. "I won't blink. You needn't worry about that." I believed her. I was not sure whether that made the next 14 days simpler or more complicated. My grandmother received Verity Holt that evening in the great bedroom by candlelight. I had told Verity that Honoria had been a celebrated beauty in her youth, and had remained in age, a woman whose regard was a thing to be earned and not presumed. I had told her my grandmother would see through anything false. I had been, I now recognized, rather severe in my preparation, because Verity came into that room and did not perform a single syllable. My grandmother lay among her pillows. She looked at Verity for a long moment, the searching, unhurried look of a woman who has no time left for anything but accuracy. "Sit here," she said, indicating the low chair beside the bed. Verity sat. "Edmund tells me you agreed to this arrangement," my grandmother said. That is either very practical or very kind. Which is it? Both, Your Grace, Verity said. The roof of my father's church needs mending before January, and your grandson requires someone who will not fall to pieces under examination. I can do a thing and have it serve two purposes without feeling dishonest about it. My grandmother looked at her for another long moment. You are going to be extraordinarily good for him, she said, even if neither of you has worked that out yet. I caught Verity's eye across the room. Her expression was perfectly composed. Only the faintest line between her brows suggested she had registered the implication. The first 3 days of the fortnight were, I think, the only ones in which we were truly strangers. We developed, in those 3 days, the habits of people who have agreed to be civil in close quarters without having agreed on anything else. We breakfasted together. We dined together. In the long evenings, when the wind came off the moor and shook the windows and the fire in the sitting room became the whole world, we sat on opposite sides of it with books, because that required less management than conversation. On the 4th day, I found her in the gallery. It is a long room on the 1st floor, cold even in summer, where the portraits of the Caro family go back 5 generations. She was standing in front of the 3rd from the left, a woman in powder and silk, painted in 1741, with her arms folded and her head tilted at a slight angle, and she did not hear me come in. That is my great-grandmother, I said. She turned, not startled. She was not, I was learning, the sort of woman who startled. She looks annoyed, Verity said. She was, by all accounts, perpetually annoyed. She lived to 94, which her descendants attributed to the preservative properties of strong feeling. Verity looked back at the portrait. She has kind eyes, she said, under the annoyance. She was angry about something specific, I think, not about everything in general. Those are different conditions. I had looked at that portrait all my life without seeing that. I stood beside Verity and looked again, and she was right. There was something in the set of the mouth that was grief dressed as indignation, not the genuine article. You see things, I said. I pay attention, she said. It is not the same skill as seeing. I have simply learned to look before I form an opinion, which I was told as a child was rude but have since decided is only honest. We stood in the gallery a while longer. It was not comfortable exactly, not the comfortable silence of people who have known each other long, but it had weight. It was the silence of two people who have found, unexpectedly, that they are attending to the same thing. She came to my grandmother's room each day. That had not been stipulated, but she went, and she stayed, sometimes for an hour. I did not always accompany her. Once, passing in the corridor, I heard them laughing, my grandmother and this woman I had known for 6 days, and I stopped walking and stood in the hall with no particular reason to be standing there. On the 7th day, the weather broke. It had been cold and gray and still, the moor wrapped in the particular silence of late autumn, and then overnight the wind turned and brought rain, and by morning the rain had become something closer to sleet, and the windows of Caldenmere Court were streaming. Mrs. Alton reported that the lower lane had flooded again, worse than before, and that the road through Edholt would be passable but difficult. Verity appeared at breakfast in her walking boots. You intend to go out, I said. My father will be concerned, she said. He knows the weather up here. I want to send word that I am well. She looked at me across the table. Unless there is a reason I should not. The lane is impassable. I know. I will go across the field to the upper track. The upper track, I said, is a 1/4 mile of exposed moorland in sleet. She looked at me with those gray eyes. I grew up here, she said quietly. I have crossed that field in worse. I went with her. I am still not entirely sure why, except that the alternative was sitting in the library knowing she was out on the moor in sleet, and I found I could not settle to it. I collected my coat and my hat and caught up to her in the entrance hall, where she was wrapping a scarf around her coat with brisk, capable movements. She looked at me. "You do not need to come," she said. "I am aware," I said. She regarded me for a moment. Then she pulled open the front door and walked out into the sleet, and I followed. The upper track was everything I had described and she had dismissed. The wind came straight off the open moor with nothing to break it. The ground was soft and treacherous underfoot, and the sleet came in horizontal. Verity walked at a steady pace slightly ahead of me, her head down, her scarf pulled high, and she did not complain and she did not slow. Halfway across, she stopped and turned. Her face was wet and cold, and she was looking at something over my shoulder. "The old stone cross," she said. "You can see it from here on a clear day. My mother showed it to me when I was small. She said it had been there since before the house was built." She paused. "You can't see it today." "No," I said, "but I know it's there." Something crossed her face. Something I did not have a name for, but that I recognized as important. We delivered the letter at the track's far end, where a boy from Edholt was waiting, and then we walked back across the moor in the dying sleet, and it was on the return that she slipped. The ground gave way where the track curved, a sudden sink of soft mud and wet grass, and she went down to one knee with a short, sharp intake of breath. And before I had thought about it, I had her arm, steadying, drawing her back to her feet. She stood. My hand was at her elbow and she was very close and the sleet had nearly stopped. She looked up at me. "Thank you," she said. It was not the reflexive thanks of politeness. It was specific, direct, the kind of thing you say to someone you mean it to. "Are you hurt?" "No," a pause. "My pride, perhaps." "I did not know you had a great deal invested in it." "Everyone has a great deal invested in it," she said. "We simply don't admit it until someone watches us fall." I did not release her arm immediately. I am noting that for accuracy. On the 9th day, my grandmother asked to speak to me alone. She was weaker, noticeably, in the way that the end approaches quickly in those last weeks once it has decided to approach at all. But her mind was entirely clear, and her voice, though quieter than it had been, still carried the authority of someone who has always known precisely what she thinks. "She is not performing," my grandmother said. "No," I said. "Neither are you. You haven't been for several days." I said nothing. "Edmund," she looked at me from the pillows, "I did not ask you to bring me a comfortable fiction. I asked you to bring me evidence that you were capable of it, that you could choose someone and let her near enough to matter." A pause. "I did not expect you to actually do it." "The arrangement is." "The arrangement," she said, with the composure of a woman who has lived through 81 years and knows a fact when she sees one, "is no longer the arrangement. It may have begun that way. It is not that way now. I am old, not blind." I sat with her for another hour. When I left, I stood in the corridor for a long time with my grandmother's words arranged in the space behind my thoughts, and I tried to assess them honestly. I had spent my life in clean arrangements. My father had been a cold man, not cruel, but absent in the way a house can be empty when the fire isn't lit, and I had learned from him, without meaning to, that wanting things was a form of exposure. You did not let people see what you wanted. You managed, and you provided, and you did not require, and in return the world offered you a kind of safety that was indistinguishable, if you did not examine it, from peace. Verity Holt examined things. That was the difficulty, or one of them. She paid attention to the portrait, to the cross on the moor, to my grandmother's face in the candlelight, to the precise distinction between a polite gratitude and a real one. She paid attention to me, not the way people paid attention to the Duke of Caldenmere, calculating what I could do or provide or deny, but in the way you attend to something you are genuinely trying to understand. I was not accustomed to being understood. I was not certain I had made it available. On the 10th evening, we were in the sitting room. The fire was built high against the night cold, and the wind had returned, softer now, a low, persistent sound against the stone, and Verity was at the writing table in the corner, with a letter she was composing, I presumed, to her father. I was reading, or attempting to. At some point, she put her pen down and looked across the room at me. "You are not reading," she said. "I am reading." "You have been on the same page for 40 minutes, she said. "I notice because I have a habit of marking time by peripheral observation, which is a lonely skill but occasionally useful." I set the book down. "What," she said after a moment, "do you actually want? Not from the arrangement, in general." The question sat in the warm air between us. I looked at the fire. "I want Caldenmere to stand," I said. "I want the tenants well managed and the land productive. I stopped. "Those are duties," she said, not unkindly, simply accurately. "Yes. What do you want that isn't a duty?" The fire shifted and settled. The wind moved against the stone. "I don't think I've permitted myself to make that distinction," I said. The silence that followed was the longest of the fortnight. It was the kind of silence you can only have with someone who is not going to fill it artificially, who will sit in it with you and not require you to resolve it before you're ready. I had not sat in that kind of silence with anyone since my grandmother had been well enough to sit downstairs. "I think," Verity said at last, in a voice that was quite careful, "that you may have trained yourself out of wanting things for so long that you have confused the discipline with the feeling." I looked at her. "That is," I said, "an inconveniently accurate thing to say." "I know," she said. "I debated saying it." A pause. "My father says I lack the instinct for tactful omission. He says it without regret, which I take as a kind of approval." "He is right," I said, "and I am not ungrateful for it." She looked at me for a moment with those gray eyes. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her letter, and I looked at the page of my book without reading it, and the fire burned low around us, and I thought, 5 more days. I thought it the way you think about a fixed point you are moving toward when you would prefer to be moving away from it. The 11th day was Sunday. The weather had lifted to a clear, bitter morning. The moor spread out under a sky the color of pewter, and Verity walked down to her father's church at Edholt for the morning service. I did not accompany her. She had not asked me to, and there was the question of appearances, and it was not a thing I had thought through. But I found, as the morning moved, that I was attentive to the sound of the front door. She was back by noon. She came into the entrance hall, and she was pink from the cold, and there was something in her expression that was quieter than usual, not sad, but weighted. "How is he?" I asked. It was Carver who had first told me about the roof, about the church, about a rector who had been trying to keep a parish together on insufficient means since his wife had died, and I had absorbed that detail without acknowledging it. She looked at me with a flash of something that might have been surprise. "He is well," she said. "He sends his regards and does not ask questions, which is the most generous thing a father can do in this particular circumstance." She unwound her scarf. "He is a good man. He has always been a better man than the living he was given deserved. Carver tells me the roof has been needing repair for 3 winters. 2, she said, 3 if you count the preliminary damage." A slight pause. "You have looked into it." "I have been aware of it," I said. "I own the living. I ought to have addressed it sooner." She looked at me steadily. "You are saying that," she said, "as if it is a confession." "It is." She seemed to consider this, the admission, the directness of it. She was not, I was learning, a woman who deflected honesty with comfort. She received it straight. "Then I am glad," she said, "that it will be addressed now. That is more useful than regret." On the 12th evening, my grandmother took a turn. It was not the end, not then. But it was serious enough that Dr. Mabley rode up from Edholt in the dark and sat with her for 2 hours, and the house took on the particular quality of held breath that comes when something is balanced, and no one can yet say which way it will fall. I sat with her through the night. At some point past midnight, I was aware of the door opening quietly and Verity coming in. She did not speak. She sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, the chair she had occupied for 11 evenings, and she folded her hands in her lap and she was simply there. My grandmother slept. At 2 in the morning, Honoria Carew opened her eyes and found the two of us sitting on either side of her bed like something out of a painting, and she made a sound that, if she had been less exhausted, might have been a laugh. "There you are," she said. "Here we are," Verity said. My grandmother looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Don't be an idiot," she said, with the last significant portion of her available force, and closed her eyes again. She was better by morning. The crisis passed. Dr. Mabley came again at 8, examined her, and told me with the careful optimism of his profession that she was stable and might have another several weeks. He also told me that she needed rest and quiet, and that the household should not agitate itself. I found Verity in the kitchen at 9 in the morning, speaking to Mrs. Alton about broth. She looked up when I came in. Her eyes were shadowed. She had not slept, or not much, but she was composed as she always was, the composure not a mask but a genuine property of her character, the stillness of someone who has learned to be the calm in the room because the room needed it. "She is stable," I said. Verity nodded. "I know, Mrs. Alton told me." A pause. "I am glad." "I owe you an apology," I said. She looked at me. Mrs. Alton became very occupied with the pot on the hob. "Why?" Verity said. "Because I brought you here under the premise of a clean fortnight with a clear ending," I said. "And you sat through the night in that chair, and I did not ask you to, and you were not obliged, and you did it anyway, and that is more than I arranged for, and I have not said so." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the range ticked and settled. "You are not obliged to apologize for that," Verity said. "I know," I said. "I am doing it because I want to." She looked at me. I could not read, precisely, what moved across her face. There were several things at once, and she was too measured to let any one of them lead, but she held the look for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she said, "Then I accept," and went back to the broth, and I stood in the kitchen doorway feeling as though something had shifted imperceptibly in a room I had lived in for years. 2 days remained. I spent them with the particular, futile clarity of a man who has understood something too late for the understanding to be comfortable. I rode out across the estate in the mornings. The moor in November, brown and silver and enormous under the pewter sky, the kind of landscape that makes you feel very small and also very clearly yourself. And I thought. I am not a man given to sentiment. I did not build this admission from romantic feeling alone. I built it from evidence, which is the only form of reasoning I have ever trusted. And the evidence was this. In 12 days, Verity Holt had not once performed. She had not managed me, or flattered me, or arranged herself to seem more amenable or more decorative or more convenient. She had paid attention, and stated true things, and sat through the night in a chair without being asked, and looked at a portrait of my great-grandmother, and found something in it that I had missed for 30 years of looking. She had said the inconveniently accurate thing when it was accurate, and she had not filled silences that did not need filling. And when I had been something close to honest, she had received it without making it embarrassing. These were, I was aware, not the qualities one was supposed to list when accounting for why a woman was remarkable. They were not beauty or accomplishment or rank. They were the qualities of a person who is entirely themselves, without apology in your presence. And they were, I now understood, the rarest and most unsettling things I had ever encountered. The morning of the 14th day, I came downstairs to find her trunk in the entrance hall. Mrs. Alton had arranged for the cart from Edholt. The lane, having had a week to drain, was passable again, and it was due at 11. Verity was at breakfast. She was dressed for travel. She was eating toast with the calm of a woman whose circumstances were settled. I sat down. "The cart comes at 11, she said. "Yes." She poured the tea. She handed me the cup and she did not make anything out of it, did not look at me with the inquiring expression of someone waiting for the moment, did not arrange the scene into a stage. She simply poured the tea and handed it across, the way you do with someone with whom you have had breakfast 14 times and know how they take it. I held the cup. Outside, the sky over the moor was very clear. The frost was hard on the ground, and the November light lay flat and pale across the stone. "Miss Holt," I said. She looked up. I had prepared something. Several things, in fact, in the hours on the moor, because I was a man who preferred to know what he intended to say before he said it. None of them seemed right in the presence of the actual person. "I find myself," I said, "in the position of a man who entered into a clean arrangement and is unable to locate, at the conclusion of it, any part of himself that wishes for the arrangement to conclude." She was very still. "That is not," I said, "a request for anything. I am aware that the terms were clear, and that you held to them with more grace than I deserved, and that what I am saying now is outside the scope of what I have any right to say. But I have had 12 days of evidence, and I do not know how to look at the evidence honestly and say nothing." A long pause. The kitchen fire ticked distantly. Somewhere upstairs Mrs. Alton was moving about. "You are saying," Verity said slowly, "that it became real for you." "Yes," I said, "I am saying that." She looked at me steadily for a long moment. The gray eyes held their usual quality of attention, the measurement, the attending, but there was something else in them now, something less contained. "I grew up in this village," she said. "I have looked at that house." A slight inclination of her head toward the window, toward the moors, toward Caldenmere Court as it appeared from Edholt, high and gray against the hill all my life. When I agreed to come here I told myself it was practical. The roof, a straightforward fortnight. I told myself that very firmly. A pause. I told myself that several additional times as the fortnight progressed, which is usually a sign that one is not fully convinced. I could not have said, in that moment, whether I was breathing correctly. "I will not," she said, "make you a comfortable speech. You know by now that I don't produce them. But I will tell you, because you have been honest with me, and it seems only right to return it, that I have not once, in 14 days, wished I had refused." The cart from Edholt was due at 11. The trunk was in the entrance hall. "Then," I said, and stopped and started again. "Then I would ask if you are willing to consider it, whether you might remain, not as an arrangement, not with terms and a conclusion agreed in advance, as yourself, here, if that is something that could be wanted." I was aware, dimly, that this was not my best performance as a man of words. I was not caring about that particularly. Verity was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are asking me to stay?" "Yes." "At Caldenmere?" "Yes." "With the intention of—" "With the intention of nothing organized or managed," I said. "With the intention of mornings at this table, walks on the moor, my grandmother for as long as she is with us, you paying attention to things and saying the accurate thing when it is accurate and not filling silences that don't need filling." I paused. "And whatever follows from that, in whatever time and form it follows." She looked at me. She was, I saw, almost smiling, the controlled thing at the corner of her mouth, the door not quite shut. "That," she said, "is either the most understated proposal I have ever heard, or the most honest one." "I hope both." A pause. "The cart," she said, "can be sent back." Another pause longer. She looked at her teacup. She looked at the window, where the pale November light lay across the frost on the sill. "I will need to speak to my father," she said. "Of course. He will have questions." "I would expect so. I would welcome them." She looked up at me. Those gray eyes, direct and clear, and something I had not seen in them before, or had not permitted myself to name. "Edmund," she said. It was the first time in 14 days that she had used my name. I am noting that because it was not a small thing. Yes, I said. Send the cart back, she said. I went to the entrance hall. I told the man from Edholt that we would not be needing the cart today, and he nodded as though this were no particular surprise, and led his horse back down the lane, and I stood in the doorway of Caldenmere Court and looked out at the moor in the November light, and felt something that I had not felt in such a long time that I had genuinely forgotten it was possible. Something simple, something clear, something that did not require management. My grandmother, when Verity came to her room that afternoon and sat in the chair beside the bed and told her, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, with the composure of a woman who has known exactly what she was looking at since the third evening, "I told you." "You did," Verity said. "I told him as well." "You did," I said from the doorway. She looked between us with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to be patient about everything, but prefers not to wait longer than necessary. "Good," she said. "Now one of you bring me some of that broth." We were married the following September. Not in November, not in December, not in the way of people who have discovered something and are afraid of losing it in the interval, though I will confess the interval was not comfortable. We were married in September because Verity said that she would not be hurried, and that a decision made in haste looks like a decision made in doubt, and that she wanted her father to walk her to the door of a church with a sound roof. We were married in the church at Edholt, whose roof had been repaired in January, on a morning when the light was still warm and the moor lay gold and quiet to the north, and the whole of the small village was in the pews. I stood at the front of that church, and I watched Verity Holt come down the aisle on her father's arm. She was wearing ivory, with her hair dressed up with a few escaping strands, and she was carrying flowers from the garden she had quietly and entirely reorganized over the summer, and she was looking at me with those gray eyes that had been taking my measure, at intervals, for the better part of a year. I was, I think, not entirely dignified in that moment. She would tell you herself if you asked. She does not produce comfortable speeches, but she tells the truth, that when she reached me at the front of the church I said, very quietly, so that only she could hear it, "You are nothing like I expected." "I know," she said. "We covered that on the first day." "I mean it differently now," I said. She looked at me, the controlled smile, the door not quite shut. Then, for the first time in my presence, she let the door open fully. "I know," she said again, "so do I." My grandmother died in March peacefully in the great bedroom of Caldenmere Court, with Verity beside her, and a late winter sun coming through the curtains, and the smell of lavender and stone. She had had 4 months after the crisis in November, which was, as she would have said herself, more than enough to see what she needed to see. I have thought since then about what she asked of me. A clean arrangement, dishonest at its root, entered into for the most practical of reasons the roof, and a dying woman's wish, and a fortnight on the moor with a stranger. I have thought about what Carver said when he told me about Verity Holt, that she was not easily rattled, that he believed that would be a requirement. He was right, it was. I was not easy to be with in those 14 days. I was guarded and managed, and so accustomed to the clean arrangement that I had no natural vocabulary for what was happening to me. I was a man who had stood in one place for so long that I had, as my grandmother had warned me, begun to feel like a monument. Verity did not treat me like a monument. She paid attention to me, the genuine kind, the kind that doesn't want anything back, and she told me the true thing when it was accurate, and she sat in a chair at 2 in the morning because the room required it, and not because she had calculated what it would cost or earn. She made the fortnight real, she made it matter. She makes everything matter still. The mornings at the table in the winter light, the walks on the moor where the old stone cross stands and can be seen on clear days, the evenings in the sitting room where she does not fill silences that don't need filling, and where I have, over years of practice, become somewhat better at saying true things before they become urgent. I was the most feared man in 3 counties. I had managed an estate and a reputation and a life of clean arrangements, and had believed, without examining it, that this was as much as a man in my position could reasonably expect. I did not know, until a woman arrived in a hired cart on a Thursday afternoon in November with water dripping from the hem of her cloak and a look in her gray eyes that said she had done more inconvenient things than this and expected to do more again. I did not know that a clean arrangement could turn real, that it was supposed to, that all it required was someone willing to pay attention and say the accurate thing and not blink.